Welcome to Old Testament History, Chapter 4, Session 3a, The Kingdoms and the Prophets, David, Part 2. We are in the midst of the tragic tale of the tumble of Saul, Israel's first king, and the report of the rise of its second. Both reigns were like someone winning the lottery overnight. They went from being basically average Israelite believers to royalty. The key difference was how they carried themselves, with pride or with humility. Was God's first choice, Saul, a mistake? No. He was the best choice there was at that time. David was from the next generation. The people were clamoring for a king, and so God showed Samuel the best person available then. And it was not as if Saul was left to stand or fall on his own. He had Samuel, who was there to counsel him, and who interceded for him fervently. But Saul let his fame and power get to his head and sinned to the point where he lost the spirit and became a tool of Satan. As we have seen so far, Saul became the pattern for every king who followed, who did evil in the sight of the Lord. We also have been introduced to David, a remarkable young man who was the pattern for everything which was the opposite of Saul, the example for every king who followed, who did right in the sight of the Lord. These two extremes openly interacted with each other in Israel 3,000 years ago, and that real-life drama reads like a modern novel, a script for a movie. But there is something about their interplay that is remarkable. David knew from the very first that he was going to succeed Saul as king, for Samuel had anointed him. Yet David did everything in his power to serve and support Saul, even when Saul tried to have him killed. That's extraordinary. How many others would have reacted like David? We are going to learn in this session the character traits of David that made that possible. We begin this session with Saul in the throes of its struggle between good and evil. One day he tried to kill David with his javelin while David was playing his harp to soothe him. The next day, Jonathan had prevailed with his father, and David was sitting at the king's table. But soon after that, Saul tried to kill him again. So David fled to Samuel, and God defended them both by the power of the Spirit. Besides God and Samuel, David had Jonathan, the king's son, as an ally. So let's start in 1 Samuel chapter 20. 1 Samuel chapter 20 and verse 1. And David fled from Naioth in Ramah and came and said before Jonathan, "What have I done? What is mine iniquity? And what is my sin before thy father, that he seeks my life?" And he said unto him, "God forbid, thou shalt not die. Behold, my father will do nothing, either great or small, but that he will show it me. And why should my father hide this thing from me? It's not so." David sware moreover and said, "Thy father certainly knows that I have found grace in your eyes," he said. "Let not Jonathan know this, lest he be grieved. But surely as the Lord liveth, and as thy soul liveth, there is but a step between me and death." Then said Jonathan unto David, "Whatsoever thy soul desireth, I will even do it for thee." So David and Jonathan agreed that Jonathan would report back to David after he found out what his father really thought about him. And David was supposed to show up at a meal, but he did not think that that was safe, to be there at the king's table. And so he was intending to be absent. So Jonathan was going to see what his father's reaction to that was. But to keep their communication secret, they decided that Jonathan would signal to David by how he shot arrows on a plot of land on the day appointed, which was the day of the new moon, the first of the month. So chapter 20, verse 20, we pick up. And he said, I will shoot 3 arrows on the side thereof, as though I shot at a mark. And behold, I will send a lad, saying, Go find out the arrows. And if I expressly say to the lad, Behold, the arrows are on this side of thee, take them, and then come thou. For there is peace to thee, and no hurt, as the Lord liveth. But if I say thus unto the young man, Behold, the arrows are beyond thee, go thy way, for the Lord hath sent thee away. So David didn't show up at the meal, and Saul blew up, and even got angry at Jonathan, his own son. Chapter 20, verse 30. Then Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan, and he said unto him, Thou son of the perverse rebellious woman, do not I know that thou hast chosen the son of Jesse to thine own confusion, and unto the confusion of thy mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives upon the ground, thou shalt not be established, nor thy kingdom. Wherefore now send and fetch him unto me, for he shall surely die. And Jonathan answered Saul his father and said to him, Wherefore shall he be slain? What has he done? And Saul cast a javelin at him to smite him. Whereby Jonathan knew that it was determined of his father to slay David. So Jonathan arose from the table in fierce anger, and did eat no meat the second day of the month, for he was grieved for David, because his father had done him shame. And it came to pass in the morning that Jonathan went out into the field at the time appointed with David, and a little lad was with him. And he said unto the lad, Run, find out now the arrows which I shoot. And as the lad ran, he shot an arrow beyond him. And then the lad was come to the place of the arrow which Jonathan had shot. And Jonathan cried after the lad and said, Is not the arrow beyond thee? So that's the signal. And Jonathan cried after the lad, Make haste, speed. Make speed, haste, stay not. And Jonathan's lad gathered up the arrows, came to his master. But the lad knew not anything. Only Jonathan and David knew the matter. And Jonathan gave his artillery, his arrows and his bow and all that, to his lad, and said unto him, Go carry them into the city. And as soon as the lad was gone, David arose out of a place toward the south, fell on his face to the ground, and bowed himself 3 times. And they kissed one another and wept with one another until David exceeded, or they wept and David more so. Verse 42. And Jonathan said to David, Go in peace, for as much as we have sworn both of us in the name of the Lord, saying, The Lord be between me and thee, and between my seed and thy seed forever. And he arose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city. Now, look at the wonderful relationship, friendship, that Jonathan and David had. In 2 Samuel, David says even that it was higher love than between men and women. Now, I dare anyone to try read more into that than what was there. Certainly was not the kind of love that some imply. Judas kissed Jesus. It wasn't that kind of love either. One must understand this in the light of their culture and not ours. It was a deep friendship. And it was special because David's life was fraught with danger, and Jonathan was the only person he had for an ally other than Samuel. So now the die was cast. David knew that there was no hope to restoring the prior relationship he had while serving Saul. And now we're going to witness one of the primary problems involved in the power struggles that pervade the halls of human power. Collateral damage. The destruction of innocence. Unintended damage. 1 Samuel 21 verse 1. 1 Samuel 21 verse 1. Then came David to Nob to Ahimelech, the priest. And Ahimelech was afraid at the meeting of David and said to him, "Why are you alone and no man with thee?" Because David was usually an agent of the king, and so therefore he'd have his entourage with him wherever he went. But then it gets dicier, because David says he's on a secret mission. Verse 2, David said to Ahimelech the priest, "The king hath commanded me a business, and has said unto me, Let no man know anything of the business whereabout I send thee, and that I have commanded thee, and I have appointed my servants to do to such and such a place." Well, that was a lie. It was not true. Verse 3, "Now therefore, what is under your hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in mine hand, or what there is present." See, he'd been out in the field and needs provisions, and so he knew that the priest had the showbread, might have had other things. And the priest answered David and said, "There's no common bread under mine hand, but there is hallowed bread. If the young men have kept themselves at least from women," not that women have cooties or anything, but they were to be ritually clean. And David answered the priest and said to him, "Of a truth, women have been kept from us about these 3 days, since I came out, and the vessels of the young men are holy, and the bread is in a manner common, yea, though it were sanctified this day in the vessel." And the priest gave him hallowed bread, for there was no bread there but the showbread that was taken from before the Lord, to put hot bread in the day when it was taken away. Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord for a vow or something religious, okay? And his name was Doeg an Edomite, the chief of the herdsmen that belonged to Saul. And David said to Ahimelech, "And is there not here under thine hand a spear or a sword? For I have neither brought my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste." Another lie. And the priest said, "The sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you slew in the valley of Elah, behold, it's here wrapped in the cloth behind the ephod. If you will take that, take it, for there's nothing to save that here." And David said, "Well, there's nothing else like that. Give it to me." And David arose and fled that day for fear of Saul, and went to Achish the king of Gath. So he went into the land of the Philistines. And the servants of Achish said to him, "Is not this David, the king of the land? Did they not sing one to another of him in dances, saying, Saul hath slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s? Verse 12, "And David laid up these words in his heart, and he was so afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. And he changed his behavior before them, and feigned himself crazy in their hands, and scrabbled on the doors of the gate, and let his spittle fall down upon his beard." Who? Then said Achish unto his servants, "Oh, you see this man is crazy. Wherefore then have you brought him to me? Have I need of a crazy man, that you brought this fellow to play the madman into my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house?" David therefore departed thence, and escaped to the cave Adullam. When his brethren and all his father's house heard it, they went down hither to him. And every one that was in distress, and every one that was in debt, and every one that was discontented, gathered themselves unto him, and he became a captain over them. And there were with him about 400 men. So, that was David's fellowship. That was his ragtag army. But you know what? If David could lead this band of misfits, he could lead anyone. So, let's read on. Chapter 22, verse 3. "And David went thence to Mizpah of Moab, and he said to the king of Moab, Let my father and my mother, I pray thee, come forth and be with you, till I know what God will do for me." So, he knew that his parents would be a way that Saul could try to get to him through them. So he makes sure his parents are out of the country and protected. Verse 4, "And he brought them before the king of Moab, And they dwelt with him all the while that David was in the stronghold, or encamped. Verse 5, and the prophet Gad came unto David. Abide not in the hold, he said. Depart, get thee into the land of Judah. Then David departed and came into the forest of Hareth. See, now the prophet Gad was going to be taking over for Samuel. Samuel was aging. Verse 6, when Saul heard that David was discovered and the men that were with him, now Saul abode in Gibeah under a tree in Ramah, having a spear in his hand, and all his servants were standing about him. And then Saul said to his servants that stood about him, hear now, you Benjamites, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards, and make you captains of thousands and captains of hundreds? No, I'm the one that does that, all right? Verse 8, that all of you have conspired against me, and there's none that shows me that my son has made a league with the son of Jesse, and there's none of you that's sorry for me, or shows unto me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as at this day. Well, had David's been stirred up against him? No. Verse 9, then answered Doeg the Edomite, which was set over the servants of Saul, and said, I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. And he inquired of the Lord for him, and gave him victuals, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. Then the king sent to call Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's house, the priests that were in Nob, and they came all of them to the king. And Saul said, hear now, thou son of Ahitub. And he answered, here I am, Lord. And Saul said to him, why have you conspired against me, thou and the son of Jesse, in that thou hast given him a bread and a sword, and has inquired of God for him, that he should rise against me to lie in wait as at this day? Then Ahimelech answered the king and said, And who is so faithful among all thy servants as David, which is the king's son-in-law, and goes at thy bidding, and is honorable in your house? Did I then begin to inquire of God for him? In other words, was this the first time I ever inquired of God for him? No, he had done it often. Be it far from me. Let not the king impute anything unto his servant, nor to all the house of my father. For thy servant knew nothing of all this, less or more. And the king said, thou shalt surely die, Ahimelech, thou and all thy father's house. So now King Saul sinks to a new low. The king, possessed with a satanic spirit, commanded all the priests of the true God to be murdered. And the king said to the footmen that stood about him, turn and slay the priests of the Lord, because their hand is also with David, and because they knew when he fled and did not show it to me. But the servants of the king would not put their hand to fall on the priests of the Lord. And the king said to Doeg, turn thou and fall upon the priests. And Doeg the Edomite turned and fell upon the priests and slew on that day 85 people that did wear a linen ephod. 85 priests. And Nob, the city of the priests, smote he with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and suckling, oxen, ass, sheep, with the edge of the sword. And then one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. There was only one left. And Abiathar showed David that Saul had slain the Lord's priests. Verse 22. And David said to Abiathar, I knew it that day when Doeg the Edomite was there. God told him that he would surely tell Saul. David said, I have occasioned the death of all the persons of thy father's house. David said, I knew it. God warned him. And yet somehow he ignored it, and he lied to the high priest so he could get some food. I'm sure God would have met his need another way if David had followed guidance. David didn't make very many mistakes, but this is one that he did make. And it was a grave one that surely affected David. How do you think that made him feel? 85 priests were dead because he didn't listen to God. Just like that incident with Moses on the way to Egypt, this caused David to make sure that he stayed sharp. Chapter 22, verse 23. Abide thou with me, fear not, for he that seeks my life seeks thy life, but with me thou shalt be in safeguard. Then they told David, saying, Behold, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah, and they're robbing the threshing floors. Therefore David inquired of the Lord, saying, Shall I go and smite these Philistines? And the Lord said to David, Go and smite the Philistines and save Keilah. Because Saul had been so preoccupied with pursuing David, but he was neglecting the affairs of state, primarily to protect Israel against the scourge of the Philistines, especially during harvest time when they would steal what was on the threshing floor. Chapter 23, verse 3. And David's men said to him, Behold, we're afraid here in Judah. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the armies of the Philistines? Then David inquired of the Lord yet again. And the Lord answered him and said, Arise, go down to Keilah, for I will deliver the Philistines into your hand. So David and his men went to Keilah, fought with the Philistines, and brought away their cattle, and smote them with a great slaughter. So David saved the inhabitants of Keilah. Saul should have done that. So David is even working for the kingdom when he is an enemy of the state. Chapter 23, verse 6. And it came to pass, when Abiathar the son of Ahimelech fled to David to Keilah, that he came down with an ephod in his hand. And it was told Saul that David was come to Keilah. And Saul said, God hath delivered him into mine hand, for he shut in by entering into a town that had gates and bars. So Keilah was a walled city, had bars across their gate. So he thought they would all be shut in and he could besiege them. Verse 8, and Saul called all the people together to war, to go down to Keilah, to besiege David and his men. And David knew that Saul secretly practiced mischief against him. And he said to Abiathar the priest, Bring hither the ephod. That's the one that had the Urim and Thummim in them that they would use to make decisions. They believed God that they would guide their hand by revelation to grab the right rock. Either Urim or Thummim, either yes or no. And David knew that Saul secretly practiced mischief, so he said, Bring the ephod. Verse 10, Then said David, O Lord God of Israel, thy servant has certainly heard that Saul seeks to come to Keilah to destroy the city for my sake. Will the men of Keilah deliver me up into his hand? Will Saul come down, as thy servant hath heard? Lord God of Israel, I beseech thee, tell thy servant. And the Lord said, He will come down. Then David said, Will the men of Keilah deliver me and my men into the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, Yep, they will deliver thee up. So, Now, David had the Spirit of God on him. So why didn't God just tell David? Well, you got to understand, we are not all spirit, all right? We're not perfect all the time. We're body and soul, too. We have weaknesses. We have needs. We think differently. So God often works with more than one believer at a time who have the Spirit upon him, like a team, like Moses and Aaron, or Deborah and Barak, or Elijah and Elisha, or Isaiah and Hezekiah, Ezra and Jeshua, Nehemiah and Eliashib, Haggai and Zechariah. Those were God's teams. And as a team, they can cover more ground. Same's true with married Christian couples today. A man and his wife will probably have different ministries in the body. And in fact, many believers have more than one of those 14 different ministries that are possible. So when they get married, their primary and secondary ministries may change so they can harmonize better. I teach about this in my One Body class and my Energized Ministries class. Well, let's get back to Samuel here. Chapter 23, verse 13. Then David and his men, which were about 600, arose and departed out of Keilah, and went whithersoever they could go. And it was told Saul that David had escaped from Keilah, and so he forbare to go forth. And David abode in the wilderness in strongholds, and remained in the mountain in the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul sought him every day, but God delivered him not into his hand. And David saw that Saul was come out to seek his life, and David was in the wilderness of Ziph in a wood. And Jonathan's son arose and went to David into the wood, and strengthened his hand in God. So apparently Jonathan had allies that would not tell Saul what they knew. So Jonathan knew right where David was, and Saul could never find him. Woo! Verse 17. And he said unto him, Fear not, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find thee, and thou shalt be king over Israel, and I shall be next unto thee. And that also Saul, my father, knoweth. Wow. Verse 18. And they two made a covenant before the Lord. David abode in the wood, and Jonathan went to his house. See, Jonathan and Saul all saw the handwriting on the wall, but they still fought against David. Verse 19. Verse 19. Then came up the Ziphites to Saul to Gibeah, saying, Doth not David hide himself with us in strongholds in the wood, in the hill of Hachilah, which is on the south of Jeshimon? You know where that is, right? Thou therefore, O king, come down according to all the desire of thy soul to come down, and our part shall be to deliver him into the king's hand. So they were going to get some favors from the king. Verse 21. And Saul said, Blessed be he of the Lord, for ye have compassion on me. Go, I pray thee, prepare yet, and know and see his place, where his haunt is, and who hath seen him there? For it is told me he deals very subtly. See therefore, and take knowledge of all the lurking places where he hides himself, and come you again to me with a certainty, and I will go with you. And it shall come to pass, if he be in the land, that I will search him out throughout all the thousands of Judah. Now, see, this is another place there in verse 23 where that word thousands should have the alternate meaning of clans. Okay? Verse 24. And they arose and went to Ziph before Saul, but David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon, in the plain on the south of Jeshimon. And Saul also and his men went out to seek him. And they told David, wherefore he came down into a rock and abode in the wilderness of Man. And when Saul heard that, he pursued after David in the wilderness of Man. And Saul went on this side of the mountain, and David and his men on that side of the mountain. They were that close. And David made haste to get away for fear of Saul. For Saul and his men encompassed David. They surrounded him. And his men round about to take them. But there came a messenger unto Saul, saying, Haste thee, and come, for the Philistines have invaded the land. So they had David surrounded, and they had to leave. Verse 28. Wherefore Saul returned from pursuing after David, and went against the Philistines. Therefore they called that place Shalamalakoth, which is, it's what you say right after boom shakalaka, right? No, that means in Hebrew, the rock of separation. I mean, they had him surrounded, and all of a sudden they had to go. The rock of separation. The people probably had complained so much about his dereliction of royal duties and wasting of men and resources to chase after David that he had to relent and defend Israel against the Philistines. Because you know what? Enemies won't stop on their own. Power will expand until it's stopped. And the main way to stop power is with opposing power. Verse 29. And David went up from thence and dwelt in strongholds at En-gedi. It came to pass, when Saul was returned from following the Philistines, was told him, saying, Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-gedi. That's over by the Dead Sea. Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel, and went to seek David and his men upon the rocks of the wild goats. And he came to the sheepcotes by the way, where there was a cave. And Saul went in to cover his feet. And David and his men remained in the sides of the cave. Cover his feet is a euphemism, meaning to go to the bathroom. Because when you stoop down to do that, your garment covered your feet. That's what that was. So he's in the cave, going to the bathroom. Verse 4. And the men of David said to him, Behold, the day which the Lord said to you, Behold, I'll deliver your enemy into your hand, that you may do to him as it will seem good to thee. And David arose, but he didn't kill him. He cut off the skirt of Saul's robe privily. And it came to pass afterward that David's heart smote him, because he had cut off Saul's skirt. Look at David's attitude. And he said to his men, The Lord forbid that I should do this thing unto my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch forth mine hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord. You see David's attitude? What just happened? David had an opportunity to kill Saul, who had been trying to kill him, but he did not do so. In order to understand this difficult situation, complex situation, we must realize that it was a balance. What to do was a balance between competing priorities. On one hand, David had the right to defend himself. On the other hand, if he had killed Saul, the evil would have only gotten worse. For David would not have escaped the cave alive, for Saul's men were outside, and there's only one way out of the cave. So, how did he know what to do? He applied the wisdom that he had, and when unsure what else to do, he surely asked God. But there is one more factor here. Saul had been anointed by God. I'm going to need to spend some time to reason through this so we can learn from it. Because there are evil people here in the world, so we got to deal with evil. But how do we deal with evil without becoming contaminated by it? We may not be able to avoid being touched by evil, but we can certainly determine how we react to it. And as we have a say in, and also we can have a say in how long we're affected by it. Now, I know this is a class in Old Testament history, but it's appropriate at this time to teach what Jesus taught about this subject. After all, what he taught was the pinnacle of Judaism. So, how do we deal with evil? Jesus said to turn the other cheek. Orthodox Christianity actually does not know what that really means. But David was wisely applying the principles regarding what it really meant. Here are some principles based on my book, Reversing Religious Repression, a new subtitle for the Sermon on the Mount, that I covered that section in Jesus' teaching. And Jesus dealt with the abusers in the first, "You've heard it's been said, but I say to you" section of the Sermon on the Mount. And then later, he addresses those who were abused. Look at Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, verse 38. Jesus said, "You've heard it been said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you that you resist not evil. But whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him also the other. And if any man will sue thee at the law, and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also. And whosoever shall compel thee to go a mile, go with him too. Give to him that asketh thee, and from him that would borrow of thee, turn thou not away." We live in an evil world, controlled by an evil landlord. Satan is the god of this world, and he sets evil in motion, just like throwing stones into a pool of water. The initial evil event causes waves that move outward, impacting others. That's why the evil realm is analogized to seas or floods or waters, because it behaves like that. When something evil happens to people, they often infect others with it. Like when we've had a bad day, we may pass it on by speaking crossly to people or maltreating others. So Satan actually doesn't need to introduce any more evil, because we're doing his job for him. We reflect the evil onward, just like waves on the water. So, how does one reverse that trend? How can evil be stopped? By good. When one allows themselves to reply in kind to evil with evil, one is yielding control to the abusers. In order to follow the encouragements of the Sermon on the Mount, to be the salt of the earth and to be the lights of the world, we cannot yield control to the adversary. You know, we've been taught about the cue ball effect. Remember that? How the adversary shoots the cue ball into other balls, and then they in turn bash into other balls. He doesn't need to hit every ball with his cue ball to make them move. The other balls do it for him. Well, the cue ball effect stops with a believer with a renewed mind. It is an initial step to not letting evil reign or to exert more momentum. We must overcome evil with good. From this section in the Sermon on the Mount, many think that Jesus supported pacifism when he said, "Turn the other cheek." Well then, does he really do that? Is he really a pacifist? Well, ask him that when he returns and conquers the world. Because the enemy won't just lay down their arms, will they? No. Jesus will be the leader of an army. But in the Sermon on the Mount, did he really mean that if someone was trying to beat you up or kill you, that you shouldn't defend yourself? That's foolish. If David did that, he'd been dead. What did Jesus mean by saying, turn the other cheek? Did he really mean that if someone is attacking your home or property, that you shouldn't defend it and your family? I mean, were Moses and the children of Israel wrong when they defended themselves from the Amalekites in Exodus 17? No. Part of the answer to that is that the sixth commandment does not read, thou shalt not kill. The Hebrew in Exodus 20:13 is, thou shalt not murder. Big difference. So, we may need to fight and kill to protect our country or family or property or ourselves. All right? Let's look at Matthew 5 a little closer. The word there, to smite thee on the cheek, the word smite in verse 39 doesn't really convey in English what Jesus actually meant. The Greek word is parizo, which means to slap with the palm of the hand, not to strike with a fist. See, he was not talking about someone trying to beat you up or harm you. All right? We even have that same kind of distinction in our laws and justice today. Now, if a woman slaps a man in the face, do they arrest her for assault and battery? No. There's culture involved there, all right? Well, in the same context in Matthew, Jesus also speaks of taking one's coat and being compelled to walk a mile. Well, why did Jesus put those things together? They have some correlation, being there together in Matthew 5. Has to be some significance to that, more than what's understood by the Western mind. But, like I said, there were competing priorities with David and Saul. On one hand, we had the principles concerning prolonging evil or not that Jesus taught. On the other hand, we know that unless you stand up to abusers, they'll keep on abusing. That's just common sense. Yet, somehow we've been taught to be carpet Christians and let people walk all over us. Well, what's respectable in that? Haven't we always known, since we were kids, that weaklings always are taken advantage of? This is one of the things that dissuade many people from becoming Christians, because they think what the church has taught is nuts. If somebody tries to beat me up, you bet I'm going to defend myself. Any other reaction is just not smart. But first we need to understand what smiting on the cheek really means. In that culture, it was a great affront or disgrace to allow someone to touch your cheek. It was like saying you're worse than dirt. It was even more demeaning for a man to allow a woman to do that to him. That was from Bishop Pillai's teaching. To touch someone on the cheek or slap them on the cheek was an affront meant to provoke or disgrace them. Look at 2 Chronicles. 2 Chronicles chapter 18, verse 23. This is Zedekiah, the son of Chenaanah, came near and smote Micaiah on the cheek and said, which way went the Spirit of the Lord from me to speak unto you? Isaiah 50 is another one. Isaiah 50, verse 6, where it says, I gave my back to the smiters and my cheeks to them that plucked off the hair. I hid not my face from shame and spitting. So you see, the shame and the spitting is in the same breath as those other things. All right? So that was what their culture attributed touching one's cheek to. It was a taunt. It was meant to disgrace someone. All right? In Western culture, we may provoke others in the same way with certain hand signals. Jesus taught for us to offer the other cheek. He was saying, don't allow the abusers to provoke you. Let them know that you won't play their games. Because if you do, then you're just prolonging evil. But if you don't, then you're helping to stop it. But when Jesus instructed us to not resist evil, the types of evil he was giving examples of were non-life-threatening kinds. In fact, there's different words for evil And the one in Matthew is poneros, which means an annoyance, a degenerate kind of evil. So Jesus was actually teaching to not overact when we're provoked and perpetuate evil. When someone tries to provoke you into a fight by trying to humiliate you in whatever way that their culture does that, well, let them know you're not going to be manipulated. You're in control of how you respond, not them. So, Matthew 5, in context, Jesus said, if somebody compels you to go 1 mile, go 2. Don't tell them to go 2, right? But anyway, since Judea was under Roman dominion, a Roman soldier could compel any person to carry their burden for a mile. So, Jesus said, go 2. The key to understanding the examples that Jesus gave is, if somebody was abusing or provoking, if we reply in kind, who would be in control? The abuser. But if we take a positive initiative, then who is in control? We are, and no longer they. And that's the first step in overcoming evil with good. So, if the Roman soldier said, you have to carry this for 1 mile, and you say, all right, sir, I'll carry it for 2. Now, who is in control? You are. Do you understand how that works? Okay? But Jesus' examples were not life-threatening. In David's situation, it was pretty dire. And that adds another facet to the situation, because force sometimes needs to be met with force. Okay? It's far better to be an alive pragmatist than a dead idealist. So, when should we fight back and when should we not? Well, when our life or family's lives or property or country are threatened, we can fight to protect them. Like I said, this is one of those difficult areas where one must strike a balance between competing priorities. Plus, when these things do happen, we often don't have a luxury of time to think things through. The situation demands we act immediately to save life or limb, family or property. So David had to ask God and then believe and act. Well, that works. James chapter 1 verse 5. James chapter 1 verse 5 says, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God. Well, what's the wisdom for? It's what to do about a situation. And God gives to all men liberally and upbraids not. He doesn't tease you from heaven and say, you're so stupid, I'm not going to tell you. No. And it shall be given him. That's what it says. But let him ask in faith, nothing wavering. For he that wavers is like a wave of the sea driven with the wind and tossed. Let not any man think that he shall receive anything of the Lord that is like that. A double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. So, David must have acted with the wisdom that I'm sure he received from God, and that was to not kill Saul when he surely could have. Instead, he spared his life, but he proved he could have killed him by cutting off a part of his garment. All of that reasoning occurred with David instantaneously. How much time do you think he had to think that over? Wow. That was God at work, don't you think? Chapter 24, verse 7. 1 Samuel 24, 7. So David stayed his servants with these words and allowed them not to rise against Saul. But Saul rose up out of the cave and went on his way. And David also arose afterward and went out of the cave and cried after Saul, David, what are you doing? Saying, my lord, the king. And when Saul looked behind him, David stooped with his face to the earth and bowed himself. And David said to Saul, wherefore hearest thou men's words, saying, behold, David seeks thy hurt? Behold, this day your eyes have seen how that the Lord hath delivered thee today into my hand in the cave, and some bade me to kill you. But my eye spared you. And I said, I will not put forth my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. Moreover, my father, see the skirt of your robe in my hand, for in that I cut off the skirt of thy robe and didn't kill you. Know thou, and see that there is neither evil nor transgression in mine hand, and I have not sinned against you. Yet you hunt my soul to take it. The Lord judge between me and thee, and the Lord avenge me of thee. But my hand will not be upon thee. As saith the proverb of the ancients, wickedness proceeds from the wicked. But mine hand shall not be upon thee. Was there any wickedness here? No. After whom is the king of Israel come out? After whom dost thou pursue? After a dead dog? After a flea? The Lord therefore be judge, and judge between me and thee, and see and plead my cause, and deliver me out of your hand. And it came to pass, when David had made an end of speaking these words unto Saul, that Saul said, Is this thy voice, my son David? And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. And he said to David, You are more righteous than I, for thou hast rewarded me good, whereas I have rewarded you evil. And you have showed this day how that you have dealt well with me, for as much as when the Lord had delivered me into your hand, you didn't kill me. For if a man find his enemy, will he let him go well away? Wherefore the Lord reward thee good, for that thou hast done unto me this day. And now Saul says, Behold, I know well that thou shalt surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Swear now therefore unto me by the Lord that thou wilt not cut off my seed after me, you'll not kill all my children, and that thou wilt not destroy my name out of my father's house. And David sware unto Saul, and Saul went home. But David and his men gat them up into the hold. Wow. Look at that. Look how David walked in wisdom. But there's even more there, because the situation was more than just dealing with an abuser. It was more than just overcoming evil with good, because Saul was God's anointed. Back in the Old Testament, those with the Spirit of God upon them were remarkable. Okay, Saul had been made into another man, remember? Now in the New Testament, since the Spirit's been poured out, all born-again believers have the Spirit, but when people renew their minds and act on it, they can be just as remarkable in their way as the prophets of old. David respected God's choice of Saul, and he also knew that even though Saul was evil at that point in time, his life could turn around, because he was in God's hands. He had already demonstrated that many times when David ministered to him with his music, remember? Saul had gotten himself right again more than once. Saul could then arise again to greatness, and so David respected that. He was God's anointed. Boy, that's something surely missing today. There are leaders in churches that have hurt God's people, and they deserve judgment. But which one of us is righteous enough to mete that out? We'll continue more after the break. All right? Bless you.